Hello, I would like to present some of my research on expressive timing in music. And so you can follow the slides here, and there are I'll play some of the examples as well. So, expressive timing in music has actually been the object of research for many decades. So you see a few names here: Rapp, Freeberg, Johnson, Gabrielson, Sundberg, Sloboda, Palmer, McPherson, Lehman, Joslin, and many others studied various aspects of music performances within a variety or with a variety of methods. An overview is given by Gabrielson, 2003. Of course, that is an older overview, but up to 2003, that's a very good overview. So, timing in music was specifically investigated by Rapp, Johnson, and more recently by Zapp and Widmer, just to name a few. And there will be a bibliography here later on. Uh, was the same slide. Okay. So I wanted to do a methodological study simply by what I can do and how I can do it. And I was looking at Beethoven's Piano Sonata Opus 2 number 1, just the beginning. In fact, just what you see here on the screen. And I chose performances by 7 different pianists: Barenboim, Brendel, Good, Hungerford, Kempf, Pollini, and Schiff. And so now here on the bottom you see the score, and I inserted those numbers. And those are important because I wanted to investigate the timing, the expressive timing. So that means I have to figure out when a note is being played, and we call this an onset. Now the duration is not the notated duration, but the duration from one onset to the next onset. For example, number 17 here in the beginning of the fourth full measure, the inter-onset duration of that first note that I labeled with number 17 is a quarter note. Although notated, it's a dotted quarter, but 1 quarter later in the left hand, a new chord comes in. So that is the inter-onset duration from... I'm trying to get my mouse here, but it's not appearing. The inter-onset duration from that high B flat to the chord in the in the left hand. So it's all about inter-onset duration, not about notated durations. So I wanted to ask, so now my picture is here in the middle, but my mouse is here now. Okay, so methodology. How accurate is the current hard and software with regard to onset detection, and what analytical questions can be solved? Those were the questions, and in more detail, to analyze inter-onset durations during or the duration from one onset to the next onset, and answer the following questions. How uniform or uneven is the pulse beat in the interpretations of different pianists, and is there a relationship to the tempo? So like in any research project, we need to really ask research questions, and those are these research questions that I wanted to answer with this particular project. Are notes falling on main beats held longer than other notes? Are short note values interpreted evenly or unevenly? If notes are held longer, are other notes played shorter to keep the pulse? How long are arpeggios? How are embellishments performed? Do or how do the performers slow the tempo at cadence points? So I chose the freeware Sonic Visualizer. Note the British spelling of it because it's a British program. So you can just Google it and you will find it online. It's free. And then there are Vamp plugins, and there are many available. Uh, so here is one that's called Node Onset Detector. And so what the Node Onset Detector um, does is it uses some information from the audio file to calculate the probability that an onset is taking place. But as you can see, visually, we see that an onset is taking place right here, but the Vamp plugin calculated that most likely it's taking place here. So that is a little bit later. It's 0.02 seconds later, right? Now, that may seem very little, but if we're talking about expressive timing, that's quite a lot. Now, here I have another a screenshot from Sonic Visualizer with two plugins. The yellow line here is the spectral flux plugin. It estimates node onsets from changes in spectral magnitude. Was developed by Crack Zap. And then the purple one here with the purple line is node onset detector. It relies on a one semitone filter bank to detect abrupt energy changes in the harmonic contents of a signal. Okay, so there are different ways of what kind of auditory information is being used to calculate these onsets. But what is interesting about this particular picture here is um, how the two Vamp plugins calculate the onsets differently. Like here, the spectral flux one is right on target of where it starts. We see that because we can determine it by just looking at it, where so we have a visual here where the onset takes place. And the node onset detector was a little bit early. Now here the node onset detector was late, and the spectral flux Vamp plugin was a little bit early, and so on. So they are not absolutely accurate. Sometimes some of the Vamp plugins don't calculate an onset where there is an onset, and sometimes they do calculate an onset when there is not one. Which means that we actually have to do manual corrections. And if I move this out, so in Sonic Visualizer, there is a tool, this one here, where I'm circling with my mouse. And so you can click on that and then click on one of these lines, which are onsets calculated by the Vamp plugin, and you can move it to the side. That means if you do have a visual, you can actually move it to, you can even zoom further in, and you can move it to wherever exactly it starts. But when you don't have an exact visual, like here, you don't really see where a node sets on, then you may have to do that differently. And I wanted to show this screen first, and I also used the freeware Audacity, and that's an audio program, and you can do editing. But one of the features I like, you can zoom in into the audio file, and you can highlight, like this is just 1/100th of a second, and then you can hit play, and you can just listen to 1/100th of a second. So of course that is not so easy because you sometimes can't even determine the pitch. But if you know what pitch to expect, up down to 1/100th of a second, it's still possible to actually orally under good headphones, to recognize a pitch if you know which pitch to expect. And so if you move this back and forth a little bit, then you can determine orally where exactly the onset takes place. So I used it whenever I didn't see a visual. But I wanted to just play so you can get an impression of how it sounds, what I analyzed. So you may have noticed that this last note that you heard, why did I include it here? Because it's obviously the pickup to the next phrase. So if I just wanted to end, I should have ended on the fermata, right? But I am calculating inter-onset durations. That means if I want to know the duration, the performed duration of this last note plus rest, then I need that next node in order to calculate that inter-onset duration, and that's why it is here. So again, so for example, number 7 is this chord in the left hand, but the inter-onset duration is only from here to the 16th triplet in the right hand, right? And that should theoretically be notated, that's 1/8 note, right? Because that's the value of the dot, essentially, of this dotted node. So that's an eighth. But in reality, we will see what it is. So anyways, here's another screen where I visualized the two onset detectors that I used, the two Vamp plugins, and also a manually corrected one. So here the dark blue one is the corrected onset, and that's the only one where lines are drawn through, because the other ones are sometimes missing an onset. Now, as you can see, sometimes the Vamp plugins are relatively close to determine the correct onset, and sometimes they are quite far off. Now, the manually corrected one I now assume as being the correct onset. In fact, I measured, I tried to statistically determine how accurate it is, and it is within a hundredths of a second. Probably most of the time within half that, but for sure within a hundredths of a second, which is relatively good accuracy. So the Vamp plugins themselves have a much less accuracy, and really it is not possible to just take the automatic onsets calculated by the Vamp plugins if one wanted to do research on expressive timing. So it requires a manual correction. So now, one of the problems, of course, was that the different performers performed in different tempos. Right? I calculated them here, and if I want to compare them, I have to, I basically have to translate the inter-onset durations as times into percentages. So if I calculate an average quarter being 260, then I can relate the inter-onset durations to that tempo, or to the average quarter note, and that is, if that note is exactly that value, then it's 100%. But of course, notes are not always performed at 100% like they are notated. Sometimes they are longer than the percentage is above 100%, and sometimes they're shorter and then the percentage is below. So that can even go here 156%. Now, looking at the percentages is not so interesting. So I visualized that here on a graph, overlaid that with the notation. And these are the 7 different performances, and here in the middle is 100%. So theoretically, if you would just have a mechanical performance of the music, then all the dots and the entire lines would be here on that 100% line. But that's not the case. But the first 5 quarter notes, even the first 6 quarter, well, this is an inter-onset quarter from here to here, are relatively evenly performed. Maybe this one goes a little bit up, and it's the first climax. That means it's performed a little bit longer. That means this chord in the left hand comes in a little bit later. But then the inter-onset duration from this chord to this 16th triplet, which should be an eighth note, is performed much faster. That means that this 16th triplet comes in when performed by real pianists, is performed much sooner. So between, I don't know what this exactly is, 80% and even down to 30%. So that is quite interesting. So that means that these 16 triplets, all three of them in most of the performances, or at least the first one and the third one, are performed longer than they should be according to the notation. And because they're held longer, this inter-onset duration is performed shorter to make up for that time, because we don't just add or subtract note value and then everything changes, but the pianist kept a relatively good pulse. So anyways, let's maybe listen to a few of these performances, or let me go first to the next screen. I also wanted to ask, well, maybe I don't consider those smaller note values in between. I just wanted to consider the beats. And in fact, I didn't consider the beat the half note, which really it is, but I wanted to look at the quarter notes here, right? So here are only the inter-onset durations from quarter to quarter to quarter, and if there were notes in between, I ignored them, right? So we can see that here this note and this note, especially this high A flat, was performed a little longer by most pianists, and the second quarter in the second full measure was performed shorter by most pianists, and again longer than shorter. Now that kind of makes sense also because beats 1 and beats 3 are emphasized as compared to beat 2 and beat 4. So let's listen to a few of them. Here's Barenboim. So now again on the screen here we only have the first couple measures. I will show the other ones later, but here's Brendel. Here's Richard Good. Okay, and we'll listen to the other four in the context of the remaining portion. Here are the percentages again, but here is the percentages translated into a graph. And so these are the very last two measures of that excerpt. And 100% is not listed here, but it's right here in the middle, between 0 and 200. As you can see, toward the ends, when we are approaching the cadence, already some of the pianists are at 200%, meaning playing a note twice as long, holding a note twice as long as notated. Now a few are close to the 100% still, but several other pianists are play it much slower, so they slow down, and we would expect that toward the cadence. Now again, this is a graph that does consider these smaller note values in between here, eighths notes and 16ths and so on. but it does not consider the arpeggio of this chord, and I calculated that separately and will show that in just a few minutes. We can see that up to here it's relatively even, although there is the note values are extended, so prolonged here on that arpeggio, and then it goes down just slightly, but it's relatively even. And then this peak here is actually this node. And let me move my picture out of the way here. So it's this node that is being prolonged. In some cases, it's 1,200% of the notated average quarter note. That is a lot. So let's, and on the next screen, I only consider the quarter notes, so no eighths in between, but quarter, 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 quarter. Well, this obviously I had to, so the last one is half. Notated half plus of course the fermata, so we expect this to be very long because the fermata is on the rest. But this is the cadence point, essentially just considering quarter note units, and we can see it's relatively calm here, and then it goes up dramatically, so slowing down this, but also this. So this last dot here is really this inter-onset duration from this to this note, from this quarter plus quarter rest to the pickup of the next phrase. So let's listen to a few others. So that was Hungerford. Here comes Kempf. Comes Paulini. And this is Schiff. Oh, second. All right. So I also wanted to ask, how does tempo and grace notes relate to each other? So in other words, how are the grace notes performed? And I highlighted them here in the score, these two grace notes. And then I actually inserted here the actual duration in seconds. So here 0.064 seconds, 0.080 seconds. But then I also wanted to understand what does it really mean in the context of the given tempo. So I translated those durations into a note value of what it would be under this tempo. So Barenboim performed these two grace notes slightly longer than a dotted 16th note. And so, you know, if you're familiar with the grace note, it's an embellishment that comes before the beat. The emphasized note is still that what really falls on that first beat of the measure. The grace note comes before that, but we can play it faster and we can play it shorter. So let's listen again, let's say Barenboim, just to see what I'm talking about. Okay, so um, now Brendel performed it slightly longer than an eighth note. Let's see how that sounds. So proportionally, Brendel performed those grace notes much longer. Now, this is the shortest overall. Richard Good performed the grace notes on average like a dotted 30-second note. So let's hear that. So very, very short. Hungerford. Slightly longer than a 16th note. Very similar is Kempf, but Kempf's tempo is much slower. But proportionally, the performance of grace notes is very similar to Hungerford. Here comes Kempf. So actually, I said earlier Richard Good was the fastest, but in fact Paulini performs an even faster, like 30-second notes proportionally. And Schiff performs them like a dotted eighth note, which I believe, let me compare them, it is the longest of all proportionally. So it's just fascinating how different pianists can perform the expression so differently, and it creates a different meaning. And we as a listener, we can decide which one we like better. Or if we are ourselves pianists, we can see, obviously, we have some freedom, quite a bit of freedom in this performance when we perform. I also asked, how do we perform arpeggios? How do pianists perform arpeggio? So we have this arpeggio, which is really the climax of that excerpt that I looked at. And I guess here I didn't proportionally say how long it was, but you can see here the extremes between Barenboim and Brendel are probably proportionally quite close. Also Kempf, and on the other extreme is Hungerford. So let me play Kempf. So Kempf has a relatively long arpeggio. That means he spreads those notes out longer. But we will hear it from the very beginning of this excerpt. And here's Hungerford, where it's almost inaudible. It's almost like a blocked chord, so almost no arpeggio at all. And something like in between is Paulini. And Schiff. and a very short one, Richard Good. So Richard Good's tempo is relatively low, but also then the arpeggiation is very, very short. Okay, so here I have some of the works that I used in this project, some of the references. Here more. Let me move this out of the way. Okay, and I pursued another study that I want to summarize here. That's on rubato. So rubato was specifically investigated by Geringer and Sanzafar, Temperley, and Clark and Baker Short, to just name a few. And I'll have the bibliography later. Todd developed an early computational model of rubato. Most recently, Andrew Elmsley wrote or pursued an adaptive neural network for expressive rhythmic perception and prediction. An older one, Palmer, purposefully investigate musical performances, or a purposefully musical performance showed a greater use of rubato. And Johnson said musicians were unable to sufficiently discriminate tempo changes. So just very, very brief summary. Of course, there's a lot more in those studies. Now, Johnson in 1996 investigated the use of rubato on an appropriate/inappropriate continuum. Musicians agreed with expert assessments. And Johnson, the same author, in 1999 found that first, performances of new phrases began a little slower, followed by an acceleration. Second, each repetition of a sequence was faster. Third, musical ideas concluded with a slowdown several beats in advance of the end of the idea. And fourth, several variations in timing were observed that could be due to physical challenges in performing these passages. Honing in 2005 developed a perception-based computer model combining a quantization and tempo track model, sensitive to note density, global tempo, and rhythmic structure. And Davis in 2009 investigated the relationship between implied polyphony and rubato in Bach's solo violin music. Violinists generally avoided extensive use of rubato when the implied polyphony alters the structure. Performances of passages with implied polyphony that is less structurally complex showed a more extensive use of rubato to bring out the contrapuntal structure. So my research question for my project were, how accurate is current hard and software with regard to onset detection? Can we use the standard deviation from the mean, that means average 16th note inter-onset duration, that means the duration from onset of one note to the next, to represent the average rubato? So that means the statistical measurement of standard deviation. Can we use that to represent the rubato? How do humans perceive the rubato in comparison? Are the 16th notes on downbeats performed longer? Or how do the performers slow the tempo at cadence points? And what other analytical questions can be solved with regard to timing in music? So some of the same questions as before, but many of the questions are very specific to rubato. I wanted to look at this Bach piece, Invention number 9, in F minor by Johann Sebastian Bach, and I chose 4 recordings. Now there are many, many more, and I'm still working on expanding this study, but initially I completed the study on these 4 performances by Glenn Gould, Wolfgang Rübsam, Andrea Bacchetti, and Ingrid Blätter. Let's listen into it, maybe not the whole piece, just the beginning, so we get an impression of how they perform. Here's Glenn Gould. let me start over. So when I grew up and as a teenager had piano lessons, my teacher, who was a amazing church musician, always told me. Now I grew up in Germany, but he always told me that Bach needs to be performed very strict, um, and maybe at the very end you can have a very slight ritardando, but very strict time-wise. When it was the first time that I heard Glenn Gould, I thought it was extremely romantic. Of course, that was nothing until I heard Wolfgang Grübsam. So extremely free with regard to timing. And in fact, I asked on several occasions some non-musicians of perhaps what time period this piece could be from, and the majority of them said romantic music because that sounds so romantic. Of course, they didn't know too much other music, but they had heard Bach before, and other Baroque music, but they thought it was romantic because this performance was romantic because of the timing. Anyways, here is Andrea Bacchetti. Okay, and finally Ingrid Blatter. So that's probably the other extreme compared to Wolfgang Grübsam, that is extremely consistent in terms of the timing, of the expressive timing. So why did I choose this piece? Because this particular piece has an onset on every 16th note, even when other voices have longer note values, but then in the other voice there are 16ths. There is an onset on every 16th until the second to last measure. So that means if we are looking at inter-onset durations, they're all 16th up to this point here, almost the end, right? So that means we can very easily calculate the average 16th note up to that point, and we can also calculate the standard deviation, which is a measurement to calculate the average deviation from the average 16th note in that case, the average deviation in terms of timing from the average 16th duration. So anyways, I also, in this experiment, I wanted to not only calculate the rubato as a standard deviation, I also, oh yeah, here's the definition of standard deviation. So or what I wanted to do with calculating the performed rubato, but I also wanted to ask how students, UG stands for undergraduate, how in this case 16 undergraduate students rated the degree of the rubato from a scale from 0 to 10. That's a somewhat unusual Likert scale, but I wanted to choose a scale that is comparable to the standard deviation, which really is um, a statistical measurement that has a value from 0 to 1, but you can then multiply it by 10, then you have 0 to 10, or multiply by 100 and have 0 to 100. But I thought, in terms of perception, to have a scale from strictest 0 to 10, then students had enough variety to choose in between, as opposed to a 5 number scale or something like that. So you actually have 11 numbers from 0 to 10. Uh, so, so I both did the calculation with I use Sonic Visualizer like in the other project to calculate the to calculate the onsets, and then I did a manual correction of all the onsets, and then I basically calculated every single inter-onset duration. So these are the results. So let me move the picture here out of the way again. And that I need to explain. So SD stands for standard deviation. And so the actual average is represented by this dot for Glenn Gould. So now here, that is the average 16th inter-onset duration in seconds. That means actual duration. So the higher up, the longer the note value. Of course, it relates to the tempo, right? If the tempo is faster, the average would be lower. And so that itself is not that interesting. The average simply indicates the tempo. And Rübsam and Bacchetti had about the same tempo. Gold was slower, and Blatter much faster. What is more interesting is this bar. This black bar represents the standard deviation. The bigger the bar, the greater the standard deviation, which means the greater the freedom of timing. That means the degree of rubato. But I wasn't initially sure if the standard deviation could actually represent the rubato, so that's why I wanted to also do the perception experiment. And now I say here scaled perception because so let's say students perceive the rubato of the gold piece to be 38%, right? That 38% may not is not the same, obviously, as 12% of the calculated standard deviation. But if I scale them so that they're even, and I use the same scale with the other performances, then if both bars get longer or shorter, then it does correlate with the standard deviation. And so it does. So one thing I found out, so first of all, I can use the standard deviation as a measurement to represent rubato, and it does it very well. And we perceive the rubato just like at least proportionally, like the calculated standard deviation. So those are very general things, and we may have thought, okay, yeah, why not? I mean, that would have been the case, right? That's trivial. But there are some less trivial things interesting here. One is this. So this has the same tempo, uh, but it has different standard deviations. And so can pieces that have the same tempo be different standard deviations? Obviously, and maybe that is a trivial thing too. What is not so trivial is if you compare Bacchetti and Gold, because it has the same standard or a very similar standard deviation, that means it has a very similar degree of rubato, both calculated as standard deviation and perceived on that scale from 0 to 10, right? What is interesting here is that the calculated standard deviation is a little bit lower in Gold than it is in Bacchetti, but the perceived degree of rubato is just a little bit higher in Gold than compared to Bacchetti. So then we can ask, does that relate to tempo? Because the tempi here are different. So the Gold chose a slower tempo. And perhaps because Gold chose a slower tempo, we perceive the rubato be higher. But in fact, it is a little bit lower than in Bacchetti. However, I ran a significant measurement, and these two are not significantly different. So we cannot generalize this, but we may further speculate on it, and devise another experiment just to focus in um, on the relationship between tempo and rubato, that if the tempo is slower, we perceive the rubato to be more, even if it is less, the degree of rubato, right? All right. We also can look at standard deviation. Yeah, Blatter is relatively clear. It was the fastest tempo, but has the least standard deviation, and it was perceived as such. So all other differences between performers were significant in significance tests, except between Bacchetti and Gold, the degrees of perceived and calculated rubatos. So, anyways, I also wanted to look at just one measure, but as a concept, and I wanted to take every 16th note of the entire piece. From every measure, I wanted to take all the first 16ths, all the second 16ths, all the third 16ths, and average them together and see if we can generalize something. And this is what came out. So generally, on average, the first 16th in each measure was performed longer, except Blatter. But Blatter was almost, here's our 100% line, right? And Blatter is right there. Very little deviation. But all other performers performed the first note a little longer, the second note around 100%, the third 16th of each measure, most of them performed slower, so longer, than the fourth one, again around 100%, and so on. So second or third, they were usually faster. They were performed faster, and when it goes up here, then those are performed longer, then those notes are prolonged. So this is performed shorter, performed shorter, performed shorter, performed shorter, and performed shorter, but performed longer and performed longer. And maybe here also just a little bit longer. So now, but we can't necessarily generalize that, because we actually need to look at the piece of music and what happens in the piece of music. So when we have the main motive, which we have here in the right hand at the beginning of the piece, whenever the motive comes, the first 16th is prolonged. And that is essentially confirming what Stacey Davis in her research also showed. That was one of the studies I summarized. Um, and some other authors as well, that whenever there is a motive, then the beginning of the motive is slowed down, and then there may be, then it may speed up. So whenever the motive comes again, we see an increase, but sometimes we see an increase on in other spots as well on the beginning of the measure. So first 16th of a measure and last 16th are often prolonged. But let's see where the motive comes again. Here is not too much of prolongation. Here we have it, right? There is a prolongation on the previous measure we had. So the 16th right before a motive is also prolonged, and the first 16th of a motive is prolonged. Here again, the 16th before the motive and the 16th with which the motive starts. Next several measures. So essentially we see the same thing. Let me move this picture out of the way here. Here again, and here. So sometimes if there is a melodic motion that is similar to the motive, we see something similar. But the further we go into the piece, the more variety in terms of timing we see. So it goes more up and down the further we go into a piece by the 4 different performers. And then toward the end, we see an increase of note values, although Bach actually composed the ritardando by moving from 16th to 8th notes, but yet most performers still prolong those notes, although they are already prolonged as prescribed by Bach himself. And in fact, that would be a very good justification for my piano teachers thought that maybe a very slight ritardando at the end, but even then, that's not really that justified because Bach composed the ritardando already. Anyways, there are lots of things that can be done in expressive timing, so we can see how performers perform. It will help us understand how music works. It will help us understand how we perceive music. Here is a summary of the results. Manual corrections are needed after automatic onset detection. Standard deviation can be used to represent performed rubato. The performed rubato, as represented by the standard deviation, is proportionally perceived as such, for which t-tests showed significant differences as long as the performed rubato was sufficiently different. So the t-test is a significance test that shows how significant are the statistical differences. And although not statistically significant, the results may allow for the hypothesis that we perceive the degree of rubato slightly higher when the tempo is lower, although the actual performed degree of rubato is similar or even lower. And this will need to be proven with a larger scale study that then hopefully will show some significant differences. But in this study, it did not show a significant difference, but we saw very slight differences in these statistical values. Also, not only the first 16th note of each motive is prolonged, but also the 16th immediately before the onset of the motive. And when the main motive does not appear, inter-onset durations are generally not prolonged. Here is my bibliography. If you want to read it in more detail, you can pause the video and look at it. Of course, there is a lot more literature, but this is some of the literature I consulted. This is the literature that I consulted for this second project. And anyways, it's a fascinating research area that might be of interest for many of the performers, because obviously performers have to figure out how to perform it. And do they just copy another famous artist, or have some other expression, and exactly how do those expressions correlate with what is happening in the music, like at cadence points, at climaxes, melodic climaxes, certain kinds of harmonic progressions, and so on. So there is a lot of possibility to do research on performance practice in music. If you have any questions or suggestions, send me an email or leave a message below this video. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you will pursue your own research on expressive timing in music. Bye.